We've all heard of it. We've been told to watch out for it in our writing. But what exactly is this white room syndrome that we've been taught to fear? Hey, it's Santa Renee, and in today's video we're going to talk about the white room syndrome. The simplest way to describe and define white room syndrome in writing is when a scene feels as though it's taking place in a white room. The scene lacks details about the setting, what things are going on around the point of view character we're following. And this can happen for a few reasons. One is when an author forgets to describe the setting. A simple case of done did forget. Next is when an author thinks they've described the setting in great detail, and in not wanting to bog down the reader, they don't add any more details, when in fact they have under-described the setting the scene is taking place in. Another possibility is an author thinking that the reader will just fill in the blanks in their mind about what the scene is like, hoping they will craft it for themselves, that the reader should fill in all the blanks with their imagination. And while reading some things for the reader to fill in themselves is good, they shouldn't have to paint the entire picture either. Our job as an author is to transport our readers to the world we're writing about, which is a daunting task, but it isn't impossible. In today's video, I'm going to go over the things you need to include in your scenes to keep them from forming into a white room. First up, we've got an example of what a white room looks like. Frank looked across the hall. Sam said to meet him there at the witching hour. He tried looking out a window. It was dark out. Well, midnight was the witching hour, right? Sitting down in a chair, he let his head fall back. He hoped Sam hadn't run into trouble. The hall was creepy at night. He didn't like being here. He wanted to get this over with so he could get back into bed. Now that scene isn't a bad scene. It's written well, pat myself on the back, but it lacks depth. We know that the character is in a hall. It's got a window, a chair. We know it's dark outside, but what does the hall look like? The setting is quite bland and boring. Here's the scene written again, but with more descriptions. Frank looked across the old hall, its paint peeling off the walls, dust floating about. Sam said to meet him there at the witching hour. He peered out the closest window, trying to see the stars through their clouded panes. Midnight was the witching hour, right? He sat down in one of the slightly splintered wooden chairs that were lined up by equally splintering tables. He prayed it wasn't old enough to break as it creaked under his almost 200 pounds. He let his head drop backward, hoping that Sam hadn't been caught sneaking out of the dorms. Sam nor himself could afford another demerit. Frank held back a cough. The air tasted stale around him, unmoving, drawing his mouth further than he was used to. The old dining hall was unsettling at night. He didn't like being here. He wanted to get this over with so he could crawl back under his quilt and be back in bed, being hugged to sleep by the juniper-scented laundry detergent his mother used to use. Now, in this scene, we've got a lot more detail, and it includes all 5 of our senses. They're all in there. We have Frank describing what the room looks like in detail. That's sight. Next we have touch. Frank feeling the splinters on the wooden chair. Then sound as the chair creaks under him. After that we have taste. The air tastes stale and dry. And the last is the scent of the juniper quilt he's remembering. And there are even more details throughout the passage. We see the room in more detail. We can feel what the character is feeling as he looks around the old hall. The hall itself is given character with its peeling paint and clouded windows. It's creepy to him. He doesn't like it. And we see more than just what the character interacts with, which is good. There's more than one window, not just the one window the character's looking through. There are several chairs that are in disuse and disarray. It makes the room feel more alive. Our characters aren't the only things in our books that should be getting personalities. Every place your reader travels with the main character should have its own unique feeling. So let's jump into how we can keep from trapping our reader into a white room. But first, it's important to note that a first draft is not going to be perfect, nor should it be. I think a big misconception is that when someone picks up a book and reads it, that what they are reading is the first draft of a story. It's how the author wrote it the first time. Big no. Writers do edit their work, some more than others, but that's okay, because a first draft is telling yourself the story, getting it down on paper, if you will. All a first draft has to do is exist. It's something I tell my writing friends often. Don't get too hung up on how your story is doing as you're telling it to yourself. You may have some grammatical errors here and there, but if you get hung up on them during the writing stage of the first draft, you may discourage yourself from finishing your book. I felt that way several times with my first book, and now that I'm working on my second, I'm working hard to remember that perfection is my enemy right now, and I just need to focus on telling the story. So my main advice is worry about these details that I'm going to talk about when your first draft is finished. It's finished. You've done your first read through, and then you add these in. Because you can edit a manuscript full of errors, but you can't edit a blank page. Alright, so first and foremost, we need to pre-establish what your world looks like. Ignoring what I just said about worrying about these things after you've finished your first draft, as you are drafting, you need to have an idea, even notes, about what your world looks like. What kind of buildings it has. Where do those buildings belong? This is all a part of the world building process. You can't write a book and have no clue what the setting is like, because setting impacts the story world so much. Knowing your story world is so essential when establishing the setting of your world. It doesn't matter if you're writing Our Earth or your own fantasy world. You have to know and understand it to write it. Know your details. Know your world. Know how your characters interact with the environment around them. How do they live? Where do they live? These things are the things you should know in the world building stage as you're drafting. If you know your world well enough, you might be able to avoid having a lot of these issues with the white room. But the key word is might. Even if you understand it from top to bottom, a white room will still crop up. It happens. Sometimes we see a scene in our mind so vividly that we don't describe it. And the reader isn't going to be able to read our mind to figure out what we were meaning when we wrote the scene we failed to describe. We need to give them enough clues so that they can color in the picture we're outlining on page. They need to be able to understand what's going on around the characters. Now, I'm not saying describe every blade of grass the main character comes across, but make sure that you understand the setting you put your characters into. Every space needs to have its own personality, its quirks, things the character notices. If a character notices something, describe it a little bit. They noticed it. It's important enough for them to have noticed. You don't have to use all 5 of our senses to describe one tiny object. Just pick what would fit best and go for it. Now, our next few points are going to seem really simple and really obvious, but they're often forgotten and overlooked when writing a scene. And that's using a character's senses. We have 5 basic senses, as I said, and then we have a few extras I'll talk about next week. Using a character's senses is the easiest way to avoid a white room, in my personal opinion. So first up for our senses, we have the sense of sight, unless your character is blind. But even some blind people are able to see some things, like shapes against a lit background. So how a character can see a room shapes their actions. If they can see an escape route that would work perfectly, and they note it when they enter the room, but don't use it for no reason, the reader is going to question it. Give them a reason to not use the obvious exit. Perhaps a guard surprised them by jumping out what they thought would be the safe exit. Or how about when a character can see something coming from 20 miles away, but doesn't do anything about it? It's so frustrating as a reader to see a character do something so stupid for no reason. Say they see a storm coming over the horizon. They make note of it and that it looks dangerous. But then they do nothing to try and keep themselves safe for the sake of plot. They think, oh, I see this looming dangerous storm coming at me. I'm going to stand in this open field because I'm macho and I don't care. The character looks like an idiot. If they need to be out in the open for plot reasons, make sure that there's good plot reasons for it. If you don't, it's poor plotting. Instead, have them think something like, oh, I see this looming dangerous storm coming at me. I have tried to find a place to take shelter, but I have failed, and now I'm alone in the open with nowhere to go. That brings good plotting. That's good tension. The reader's going to be worried about how the character will somehow survive this storm instead of hoping they get blown away into a tree by it. You can also use the sense of sight to describe a physical room a character is in, the colors around them, the looks on their friends' faces, the wound that's marring their leg after a battle. Talking about a character's sense of sight is one of the best ways for a reader to see what's going on around them. What they can and cannot see affects the plot of the story, both with their eyes and their brain. A character needs to be able to process what's going on around them emotionally and critically too. How a room looks can really affect a person. If a room looks comforting and inviting, make the reader feel all snuggly and at home when the point of view character settles onto the setting of the room. If you want to make the reader feel uncomfortable in that same room, write that everything seems too perfect, or that there are a few details they can see that poke through the facade of perfection. How a room looks really sets the tone for the scene ahead. It doesn't have to 100% match the mood, but complement it. Alright, and the last sense we're going to talk about today is sound. Just because sight is super important doesn't mean that it's the only sense we should write about. The other senses are just as important for immersing your reader into your world. Sound can build amazing tension, our hero being trapped in a dark room, and all they've got is their sense of sound as they're smushed into this dark closet, listening as voices draw closer and drift farther. Someone brushing up against the door as they bend to possibly tie their shoe. Sound is a great tool for reinforcing your setting. If a character is outside, they should be able to hear outside things, like birds. If a character is standing right next to a waterfall, they may have to yell to be heard by their teammates, and vice versa. If a storm is brewing nearby, maybe they can hear the roaring wind and gathering thunder. The sense of sound brings a cozy feeling. The reader feels like they're right there with the character, and sound tells a lot for what's going on around the world. If your point of view character is in a busy market, we should be able to hear that market. Are people yelling about a sale, trying to haggle with prices, arguing over produce? All of these things are immersive details that should be included. Sound makes places feel different. They make them feel alive. Perhaps a room that was once full of joy and life feels so different since a team member's death in a book. Sound brings weight. Sound brings depth. Sound is important. Think of just how boring a movie would be if it had no sounds. And I'm not talking about background music or sound effects. Just sounds in general. Sounds of walking, nature, normal sounds a building makes. It's all there to create the setting that you've built. Now, closing up, you may be wondering what our other senses really have to do with a white room. Again, a white room happens when we don't describe a setting well enough. It's not just sight. It's all of the character's senses. That's what builds a setting, makes it feel real and alive. Next week, we'll finish up the senses and how we can use them to eliminate the white room and strengthen your writing overall. Right, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to let me know in a comment down below. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring that bell so you get notified whenever I upload a video. I upload here on Wednesdays and Saturdays. And you can also follow me on social media for other fun content I post through the week. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all at Xana's Books. Bye!